Have you ever looked at a woman living alone and wondered why? No partner. No relationship on the horizon. Not even appearing to search for one. The easy assumption is that something went wrong. Heartbreak, maybe. Or simply bad luck. But what if the real answer is something far more confronting than that? What if she isn't lost at all, but in the middle of finding something most people never find? She isn't lonely. She's selective. She isn't cold. She simply reached a point where she stopped burning herself to keep others warm. And there is something quietly unsettling about a woman who has stopped needing a relationship to feel complete, because it dismantles a very old story we were all handed about what a woman's life is supposed to look like. Most people don't know what to do with a woman like that, and many women are still learning to recognize themselves in her. Carl Jung, one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century, believed that everything we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves eventually becomes part of what he called the shadow, the hidden, unconscious layer of the self. And in many ways, the woman who chooses to live alone has become a kind of mirror for that collective shadow. She represents something many people privately long for, but rarely have the courage to pursue. A life built entirely around their own inner truth. She doesn't perform her choices for an audience. She doesn't need applause. She simply lives. And that quiet confidence makes people deeply uncomfortable. In this video, we'll look at this woman through the lens of Jungian psychology, and what we find might surprise you. Before we continue, if any of this already feels familiar, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment. Stay until the end, because if any part of her story sounds like yours, you may see yourself very differently by the time we're done. The silence around a woman who lives alone isn't emptiness. It's more like a sanctuary. A space she built deliberately, not to keep the world out, but to keep herself intact. People who don't value that kind of inner space often mislabel it. They call her cold, distant, maybe a little arrogant. But what they're actually looking at is someone who knows the difference between being open and being invaded. And she's no longer willing to confuse the two. Jung pointed out that what we fail to examine in ourselves, we tend to project outward onto other people. And many women still unconsciously equate solitude with failure, as if being alone is something that needs to be corrected. But this woman turned her gaze inward instead of outward. And in doing so, she came face to face with things she had been avoiding for years. Old wounds, attachments she had mistaken for love, patterns she had inherited rather than chosen. Her decision to be alone didn't come from a fresh wound. It came from one that had finally healed. She has known chaos. She has given too much to people who took it without question. She has stayed in situations far longer than she should have, convincing herself that this was love. But at some point, the disappointment stopped hurting and started teaching. What you see now, the calm, the groundedness, the selectivity, isn't emotional damage. It's what emotional maturity actually looks like. And maturity is confronting because it demands depth, presence, and honesty from anyone who comes near it. She doesn't want to be rescued. She wants to be truly seen. And that requires something entirely different from charm or good intentions. It requires the willingness to meet her in the depths. When a woman becomes whole in this way, she tends to trigger two very different reactions in the world around her. Deep admiration from those also seeking that wholeness, and quiet fear from those who are still waiting for someone else to make them feel complete. The world doesn't easily accept a woman like this. We live in a culture that still treats couplehood as proof of worth, where being single past a certain age gets read as a sign that something went wrong. She hears it constantly. You're being too picky. Nobody's perfect. You should put yourself out there more. And she smiles. Not out of contempt, but because she now understands that what people call being picky is simply having a minimum standard it took her years to realize she deserved. She isn't looking for someone perfect. She's looking for someone emotionally grown up enough to love without causing harm. And that, honestly, is rarer than people like to admit. The discomfort she creates in others isn't about anything she says. It's about what she represents. She is living proof that happiness doesn't require another person. And that, for certain kinds of people, is destabilizing. Men who rely on a woman's self-doubt feel threatened by her certainty. Women still caught in cycles of seeking approval feel quietly judged by her freedom. But she isn't trying to challenge anyone. She's simply being herself. And the authenticity of someone who has genuinely broken free is its own kind of mirror. Jung once described psychological growth through a striking image, that a tree reaching toward light must also send its roots deep into the darkness beneath it. And that is exactly the path this woman walked. She descended into her own story, faced the fears, the inherited pain, the emotional patterns passed down through generations of women before her. She broke cycles that weren't even originally hers to carry. She learned that it was never her job to heal someone else, rescue someone else, or shrink herself so that someone else could feel bigger. When she stopped accepting less, the world pushed back. But she held her ground, first with uncertainty, then with growing awareness, and finally with the kind of steadiness that can only come from having survived your own inner abyss. Jung called it individuation, the process of becoming fully and authentically yourself. Not the version of you shaped by expectations, not the mask worn for others, not the role handed down by family or culture. The real you, with everything that entails, light and shadow, certainty and doubt, strength and vulnerability. This woman has lived that process. She fractured, faced what was in the dark, went through the reconstruction, and came back more whole than she'd ever been. Now that she can recognize herself clearly, she refuses to go back to being half of anything. What she seeks now is not someone to complete her. She wants someone to grow alongside. Someone who has also done the inner work, who knows themselves well enough to love responsibly rather than out of fear or need. That is a high bar. Not because she's demanding perfection, but because she's experienced enough contrast to know the difference between a connection that expands her and one that quietly diminishes her. Every no she gives is an act of self-respect. Every boundary she holds is a reminder, to herself, more than anyone, that she is no longer available to be loved carelessly. Her journey isn't a straight line. There are nights of real, quiet, moments of nostalgia, days when the path feels longer than she'd like. But woven through all of it is a growing strength. The kind that only comes from making conscious choices again and again, even when the easier option would have been to settle. She learned that genuine love doesn't cage or consume. It doesn't require her to constantly negotiate who she is. The love she's waiting for isn't about salvation. It's about celebration. It won't come to fill a void. It will come to overflow alongside her. She still wants love. She still wants to be held, to be chosen, to belong somewhere with someone. But she wants it without losing herself in the process. Because she's spent enough time trying to squeeze into shapes too small for the soul she carries. She won't offer herself where there isn't room to be fully herself. And that kind of clarity, gentle but non-negotiable, is what makes her difficult to understand for those who have never really made that demand of themselves or of love. Jung observed that where social convention dominates, authentic selfhood tends to disappear. This woman no longer lives by convention. She lives by essence, by what is actually true for her, not what is expected or approved of. She no longer fights for attention. She radiates a kind of presence instead. She's not waiting to be chosen. She does the choosing. And that simple reversal, quiet as it is, unsettles the very structures that were built on the assumption that women would always be waiting. What few people understand is that her transformation isn't just personal. It's archetypal. She has tapped into something ancient, A wisdom that says women were not born to serve as background characters in someone else's story, but to express, to overflow, to bring the fullness of who they are into everything they touch. In accessing that, something in her woke up, an instinctive, emotionally sovereign self. A woman who, though physically alone, is in deep communion with her own direction. No matter how many labels get attached to her, cold, difficult, unreachable, none of them land. Because she no longer measures herself against other people's comfort. She measures herself against her own truth. She has already crossed a threshold that most people spend their whole lives standing in front of. And on the other side, she found something unexpected. The most meaningful relationship begins only after you have truly learned to love yourself without condition. That is not arrogance. It is simply what Jung called wholeness. And it changes everything. There is something almost tangible about the way this woman moves through the world. She doesn't need to raise her voice to be heard. Her confidence is quiet. And it's that quiet confidence that carries the most weight. Wherever she is, the energy in the room tends to shift. Not through performance or effort. Simply through the presence of someone who has already fought the hardest inner battles and chose to return in peace. Not because all the fears are gone, but because she learned to live alongside them without being controlled by them. Jung believed that wholeness doesn't come from eliminating the difficult parts of ourselves. It comes from integrating them, bringing together the light and the shadow, the tenderness and the strength, the need and the freedom. This woman doesn't reject love. She refuses to submit to relationships where she must make herself smaller so the other can feel bigger. She wants love that has room for all of her. The parts that are easy to love and the parts that aren't. Those who only want the easy, comfortable version haven't yet understood what love is really capable of. And she's too whole to pretend otherwise. Deep down, the world has always been slightly afraid of women who don't need. Women who don't fold, don't beg, don't reshape themselves on demand. Because these women quietly challenge the invisible agreements that said a woman's worth depended on her attachment to someone else. When she breaks that agreement, when she rewrites her own story, she doesn't just free herself. She becomes, without even trying, an invitation for others to consider doing the same. And for certain structures, that is genuinely revolutionary. So she keeps going. Sometimes with doubt. Sometimes with tears she doesn't share with anyone. But always with her feet on the ground. Because now she knows she isn't alone. She is with herself. And after everything she has walked through, that is enough. The love that eventually enters her life won't look like rescue. It will look like recognition. It won't arrive to fix something or fill something. It will arrive because two people who are each complete chose to share that completeness. She's no longer in the business of convincing anyone that she's worth loving. She doesn't try to earn space in someone else's life or to make herself more palatable. Presence should be invited, not demanded. And she's learned the difference between the two by heart. She steps away from what doesn't nourish her. Not with anger, not with drama, but with the quiet dignity of someone who has been lost enough times to know she can no longer afford to ignore her own signals. Her intuition has sharpened through experience. Her energy has become a kind of filter. She can sense early on what carries real depth and what is simply well-rehearsed performance. And she no longer hesitates to trust that sense, even when it's inconvenient. This isn't rigidity. It's earned discernment. What she wants, and what she's willing to wait for, is a soul-level alliance. A connection where neither person has to diminish themselves so the other can feel adequate. Where both can bring their shadows as well as their light, their silence as well as their noise. She's too free to accept love disguised as a comfortable prison, too sensitive to endure shallow connection, and at the same time, strong enough to keep choosing this path, even on the difficult days, even when misunderstood. Because she knows now, Trading the depth of her inner life for the comfort of not being alone was always the worst bargain. When a woman consciously chooses her own path, the world often rushes to tell her she's making a mistake. But somewhere beneath the noise, she can feel something aligning inside her. It isn't pride. It isn't rebellion. It's the rare quiet of someone finally living in a way that matches who she actually is. Jung described this process, becoming fully and authentically yourself, as one of the most essential journeys a human being can undertake. And once it begins in earnest, no external force carries more weight than the truth she's uncovering inside herself. That truth doesn't announce itself loudly. It shows up in small, clear moments. The way she closes a door without anger. The way she withdraws from environments that stopped nourishing her, without guilt, without drama. The way she smiles, even when she's the only one there. She discovered that solitude isn't a punishment. It's a commitment to herself, a loyalty to her own soul that she now honors in the same way she once desperately offered it to others. And the soul of a woman who has genuinely awakened doesn't beg, doesn't dim, doesn't perform. It simply exists, fully and without apology. The world will keep trying. It will offer distractions and ready-made solutions and reasons why she should settle for something more convenient. But she's already seen behind the curtain. She understands now that it was never really about finding the right person. It was about never losing herself again in the process. And from that place, that rooted, awake, fully inhabited place, everything begins to transform. What once felt like lack starts to feel like choice. What once bound her starts to set her free. What once caused only pain now also teaches something. That is what individuation looks like from the inside. The woman who chooses to live alone is more than just someone who doesn't fit a conventional mold. She is a living symbol of emotional freedom, a reminder that it is possible to rebuild slowly, without panic, without needing to prove anything. She doesn't walk ahead of others or follow behind them. She carves her own path. And along the way, quietly, she lights small fires for other women who are beginning to wake up to something similar in themselves. If something in this story stirred something in you, maybe it's because you, too, are on the edge of a new kind of love. One that begins with coming home to yourself. A love that lives in silence, in truth, in presence. A love that can't be negotiated down or begged into existence. And if that love hasn't arrived yet, perhaps it's because you first needed to become the woman who no longer accepts anything less. That woman is already here. She's been here the whole time. Jung taught us that the path to wholeness isn't found in another person. It's found in the honest, often uncomfortable work of becoming fully yourself. Shadow and light together. This woman has walked that path. She is proof that choosing yourself, again and again, is not a consolation prize. It is the whole point. If this video found you at the right moment, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to the channel, because this is only the beginning of the conversation. Your soul already knows the way. Trust it.